Long before walls became normal, sleep belonged to the weather. The human body may have closed its eyes, but the ground beneath it was often cold, uneven, and damp. Rain, mist, flooded soil, wet grass, caves that dripped, shelters that failed, or nights spent too close to open earth may all have shaped what rest once meant. And somewhere inside that long history is a quiet question about comfort, protection, and how recently safety became ordinary. Why 90% of human history had no dry place to sleep? Before sleep became something that happened behind a closed door, it belonged to places that could not be fully controlled. A body might grow tired, the eyes might become heavy, the hands might stop working, and the group might settle for the night, but the world did not step aside for human rest. The ground still held the day's moisture, the air still cooled after sunset, leaves gathered water, stone kept cold inside itself. Soil that looked firm in daylight could become soft beneath a sleeping hip or shoulder. For most of the long story of our species, sleep was not separated from earth, weather, insects, smoke, wind, or the slow change of night. It was one more act of survival, placed inside the same landscape that had to provide food, water, firewood, shelter, and a way through the next morning. This is difficult to feel from a modern room. A mattress lifts the body away from the floor. A roof turns rain into a distant sound. Walls make wind seem like something outside the story. Sheets dry quickly, and a damp bed is treated as a problem, not as the normal shape of existence. Yet the human body is much older than the bedroom. It began in open landscapes, along rivers, under trees, near rock shelters, across grasslands, in shifting climates, and later in many different corners of the earth where cold, rain, mud, and seasonal change were not rare interruptions. They were part of the background of life. When early humans looked for a place to sleep, they were not looking for comfort in the modern sense. They were looking for the least bad surface, the least exposed hollow, the driest patch under a ledge, the place where smoke might reach, the place where a child could be held close, the place where a sleeping body was not completely given over to the night. A dry place, in that world, was not a permanent possession. It was a temporary success. It might last until the wind shifted, until rain returned, until mist gathered before dawn, until the fire weakened, or until the group had to move again. This matters because sleep is often imagined as passive, as if ancient people simply lay down when they were tired. But a sleeping body is vulnerable in very ordinary ways. It loses heat more easily when still. It cannot keep adjusting its surroundings with the same alertness. It presses its skin, bones, and joints against whatever lies beneath it. If that surface is damp, the cold enters more patiently. If the covering is wet, warmth slips away. If the ground is uneven, rest becomes a series of small awakenings rather than one deep surrender. None of this requires a dramatic scene. It is enough to imagine a quiet night, a few people near a fading fire, the smell of wet earth, and the body trying to sleep while the world remains unfinished around it. The beginning of humanity was not a beginning of beds. It was a beginning of bodies learning to rest wherever survival allowed them to stop. Long before houses became common, long before floors were raised, long before woven bedding, sealed roofs, and rooms with doors, human sleep had to negotiate with the ground directly. Sometimes there may have been grass, leaves, hides, branches, bark, ash, or a natural hollow that gave some relief. Sometimes there may have been rock overhead. Sometimes a campsite may have been chosen again because it offered slightly better drainage or less exposure to wind, but these were not guarantees. They were small adjustments inside a much larger uncertainty. The question, then, is not only why ancient people lacked dry places, it is why the human body, with all its need for warmth, recovery, and safety, had to pass through so much time before dry sleep became ordinary. To understand that, we have to begin with a simple reversal. For most of our past, the night did not belong to the sleeper belonged to the night. The modern mind often treats dryness as the natural condition of sleep. We enter a room, close a door, lie down, and assume that the surface beneath us will stay separate from weather. Even when rain falls outside, it arrives as a sound, not as a substance touching the body. But in the deeper human past, this separation was fragile or absent. The place where a person slept was usually part of the same living surface where water collected, Animals passed, plants decayed, smoke drifted, and temperatures dropped. A patch of ground could be chosen carefully and still change during the night. A hollow that looked sheltered at sunset could gather cold air before dawn. A layer of leaves could soften the body and still hold moisture close to the skin. A rock shelter could reduce rain from above while allowing dampness to rise from below. The body did not simply sleep on the earth. It slept with the earth, and that made rest less private, less sealed, and less certain than we now imagine. This does not mean ancient nights were always miserable, or that people had no knowledge of comfort. Humans are observant animals. Long before permanent houses, people would have noticed slope, drainage, wind direction, the smell of wet soil, the difference between dry grass and rotting leaves, the safer side of a fire, the value of a ledge, the way some places stayed damp after others had dried. They were not helpless before the landscape. But knowledge does not remove every limit. A group may understand where the best sleeping place is and still find it already soaked, too exposed, too far from water, too close to danger, or unavailable because the season has changed. In a world of movement, there is rarely a perfect place every night. Survival often means choosing the best compromise, not the ideal answer. The origin of human sleep, then, belongs to compromise. It belongs to bodies settling in places that were good enough for a few hours, good enough for a child to be held, good enough for fire to be watched, good enough for the group to stay together until morning. When we ask why so much of human history had no dry place to sleep, we are really asking why one of the body's most basic needs was lived under conditions of uncertainty for so long. The answer cannot be found only in beds, because beds are late. It cannot be found only in houses, because houses are late. It begins earlier, with the fact that humans evolved as mobile beings in open environments, not as creatures born into sealed rooms. Our ancestors carried their shelter partly in the group, partly in fire, partly in tools, partly in memory, and only slowly in built structures. The night was met with whatever could be carried, gathered, leaned, burned, stacked, or remembered from the last time a place was used. This made sleep more dependent on landscape than we are used to admitting. A dry place was not simply a physical surface. It was the result of weather, terrain, season, available material, group size, energy, and luck. Even the word dry becomes less simple when placed in deep time. A place could be dry above but cold below. It could be dry at dusk and wet by morning. It could be dry near the fire and damp at the edges. It could be dry enough for an adult but not enough for an infant. It could be dry for one night and useless after a storm. The modern bedroom hides these small differences, but ancient bodies would have felt them directly. A sleeping shoulder, a curled spine, a cold foot, a damp covering, a child pressed against an adult for warmth. These are not dramatic images, but they are close to the beginning of human life. They remind us that sleep was never only a biological rhythm. It was also an environmental event. The body needed darkness, tiredness, warmth, and relative safety. But the world offered those things unevenly. Before dry sleep became normal, people had to learn the night through repetition. They learned which surfaces betrayed them. They learned which places held water. They learned that rest could be interrupted not by fear alone, but by cold soaking slowly into still flesh. In that long, quiet education, the human body did not become separate from the ground. It learned, night after night, how little separation there was. Once we place sleep back inside the open world, the first misunderstanding begins to fade. Ancient rest was not a smaller version of modern rest. It was not a bed removed from a house and placed under the sky. It was a different relationship between the body and the place where the body stopped. Today, sleep often feels like withdrawal. We leave the day, close the curtains, reduce the light, cover ourselves, and expect the room to remain stable until morning. But for most of human history, stopping did not mean leaving the environment. It meant entering another form of contact with it. The same ground that carried footsteps, tracks, roots, stones, insects, ash, fallen leaves and animal traces also became the surface for the sleeping body. The same air that moved through grass or trees also moved across skin. The same moisture that rose from soil after sunset could gather under a covering, inside a shelter, or around the edges of a fire. This is why the question of a dry place to sleep is not a small detail. It opens a wider view of how recently humans learned to create a boundary between themselves and the night. In deep human time, that boundary was thin. A branch roof might slow rain but not stop mist. A hide might cover the body but still grow damp. A shallow cave might feel protected and still drip from stone. A campsite near water might offer life in the day and chill in the night. A forest might break the wind but hold wetness close to the ground. A grassland might dry faster after sun, yet become cold and exposed after dark. None of these places were simply good or bad. They were mixed, changing, and temporary. Early humans did not live in a world without sheltering intelligence. They lived in a world where shelter was limited by what could be found, carried, built, repaired, and abandoned. That is a very different condition from a permanent dry room waiting every evening. It also changes how we imagine the body itself. The body that sleeps indoors can forget how much effort is hidden inside ordinary comfort. It forgets that dry cloth, dry floors, raised beds, sealed roofs, and predictable warmth are not the default state of nature. They are solutions built slowly over generations. Earlier bodies had to read the ground with more attention. A slight rise might matter. The direction of runoff might matter. The smell of damp vegetation might matter. The position of the fire, the nearness of others, the season, the slope, the thickness of leaves, and the memory of previous nights might all shape where rest could happen. Sleep began before the eyes closed. It began in choosing a place where the earth might be less wet, where the cold might be less sharp, where the group could remain together, where the night could be endured without too many small failures. The origin of human sleep was therefore not only in the brain's need for recovery, it was also in the landscape's permission. The brain could ask for rest, but the ground decided part of the answer. This is a quiet idea, but it reaches deep into the story of our species. Human beings did not first become human in sealed spaces. They became human while moving through places that changed with rain, drought, wind, fire, migration, and season. For a very long time, the body's nightly question was not, "Is my bed comfortable?" It was closer to, "Can this place hold us until morning?" A dry sleeping place, when it appeared, was not merely comfort. It was a sign that people had found a momentary advantage against exposure. It meant the body could lose a little less heat. A child might stay warmer. An elder might rest with fewer awakenings. A tired hunter, gatherer, parent, or watcher might let the muscles loosen slightly more. But because these advantages depended on weather and movement, they could vanish quickly. The next night could be different. The next campsite could be worse. The same shelter could fail after rain. The same ground could become mud. This uncertainty is what the modern bedroom quietly erases. It makes sleep feel like an entitlement of the body, rather than a negotiation with the world. And yet, beneath the mattress and the roof, the older pattern is still understandable. We still notice damp sheets. We still dislike cold floors. We still curl inward when chilled. We still seek elevation, covering, warmth, and walls. These reactions do not prove a single simple story, but they remind us that the body is older than the room that protects it. The first human nights were not built around dryness. They were built around staying close enough to warmth, close enough to one another, and far enough from the worst of the wet ground to continue into morning. The body understands a wet night before the mind explains it. A person does not need a lesson in deep history to know the small discomfort of damp cloth, cold skin, or a floor that seems to pull warmth downward. Even in a modern room, a little moisture can make rest feel wrong. A shirt that is not fully dried, a blanket touched by humidity, a cold tile beneath bare feet, or a mattress that feels faintly clammy can disturb the body before any clear thought appears. The reaction is quiet but immediate. Muscles tighten, shoulders rise, knees draw inward, the spine looks for a smaller shape, breath changes slightly, as if the body is measuring whether it can safely let go. This ordinary response gives us a doorway into the older human night. Long before dry rooms became common, the body met the sleeping place directly. The skin did not rest above the world. It pressed into the world. The hip, the shoulder, the back of the head, the knees, the ribs, and the feet all learned the surface beneath them. If that surface held water, the body felt it slowly. If the air cooled after sunset, stillness made the cooling more noticeable. If a covering had gathered mist, it no longer behaved like simple protection. It became another damp layer touching the sleeper. This is why the question of dry sleep is also a question about biology. Humans are warm-blooded animals with bodies that must protect internal temperature while also allowing the brain and muscles to recover. During sleep, a person is less able to keep choosing, lifting, shifting, gathering, feeding the fire, or moving away from a bad place. The body can turn, curl, pull close to others, or wake, but it cannot manage the night with the full attention of daylight. A wet surface makes this more difficult because water carries heat away more efficiently than dry air or dry fiber. The effect does not need to be extreme to matter. A little dampness, repeated across many nights, can shape how people choose shelter, how close they sleep to one another, how carefully they arrange leaves or grass, and how much they value any surface that separates flesh from earth. At the beginning of human life, sleep was not only a state inside the brain, it was a whole-body event, and the body had to ask the ground for permission to rest. The back needed a surface that would not steal too much warmth. The joints needed a position that would not become painful too quickly. The skin needed a barrier from mud, insects, grit, sharp stems, and cold stone. The lungs needed air that was breathable near smoke, damp vegetation, or enclosed rock. The ears remained part of the night, hearing movement beyond the fire or beyond the shelter. None of these needs disappeared when the eyes closed. They only became quieter. The sleeping body carried them into darkness. That is very different from the modern idea that comfort begins with softness. For early humans, softness alone would not have been enough. Wet leaves can be soft, mud can be soft, moss can be soft. A low hollow can seem gentle under the body and still become colder by dawn. What mattered was not softness by itself, but a fragile combination of dryness, warmth, distance from the cold ground, and enough protection to allow the body to loosen. In this sense, the ancient search for a place to sleep was also a search for a place where the body could stop defending itself for a little while. It was never complete. The weather remained near. The earth remained near. And the body, even when exhausted, still had to feel its way through the night. A dry bed protects the body so quietly that most people no longer notice what is being protected. It is not only the skin, it is the slow balance of heat, pressure, breathing, and trust that allows sleep to deepen. When the body lies down, weight settles into a few points. The shoulder receives the ground. The hip receives the ground. The side of the knee, the ankle, the elbow, the ribs, and the back of the skull may each find a hard place beneath them. On a dry, raised surface, these points can relax more easily. On damp earth, the same points become places where the outside world enters the body. Moisture touches first, then cold follows, and then the sleeper begins to make small corrections without fully waking. A foot pulls inward, a hand reaches for a covering. The spine curves. The body becomes smaller, not because it is afraid in a dramatic way, but because it is trying to hold warmth inside itself. This small curling shape is one of the oldest images of human rest. It belongs to infants, adults, the tired, the cold, and the exposed. It reminds us that sleep is never only a mental event. It is also an arrangement of flesh against the world. In the long beginning of human life, there was no guarantee that this arrangement would be kind. Early people may have used hides, grasses, leaves, bark, ash, branches, or other available materials to soften and separate the body from the ground, depending on place and time. But every layer had limits. Leaves could hold water. Hides could become damp. Grass could compress under weight. Bark could be uneven. Ash could be warm near a fire, and cold at the edge of a campsite. A layer that helped at sunset might feel different after hours of breath, mist, and falling temperature. The body would learn those differences not as ideas, but as sensations. A cold hip, a numb arm, a damp back, a neck held at an awkward angle, a knee pressed against stone. These are not large historical events, but they are exactly the kind of ordinary facts that shaped ancient sleep. When we ask why so much of human history had no dry place to sleep, we are also asking how human bodies endured thousands upon thousands of nights in which rest was partial, interrupted, and shared with the surface beneath them. The body's need for recovery did not wait for architecture. Muscles still needed repair after walking, carrying, digging, climbing, gathering, hunting, nursing, watching, and moving through rough land. The brain still needed sleep. Children still needed warmth. Older people still needed a chance to rest sore joints. But the environment did not provide a clean boundary between effort and recovery. The same body that spent the day dealing with terrain had to lie down on terrain at night. That means the ground was not just background. It became part of the body's nightly condition. If the earth was cold, sleep changed. If the air was wet, sleep changed. If a covering failed, sleep changed. If the group had to stay near water, near animals, near fuel, or near a route of movement, then the best place for survival might not be the best place for dry rest. This is an important difference. Ancient sleep was not always arranged around comfort first. It was arranged around the larger needs of staying alive. A dry patch mattered, but it had to compete with safety, food, fire, children, distance, visibility, shelter, and the next day's movement. The body may have wanted dryness, but the group needed many things at once. So the sleeping body became patient. It learned closeness. It learned curling. It learned to rest in fragments. It learned to share warmth. It learned that the world did not become gentle simply because the eyes closed. The body does not remember history in the way a book remembers it. It does not keep dates, names, or clean explanations. It keeps older things in quieter forms. A tightening when cold touches the skin, a wish to pull the knees closer, a dislike of damp fabric, a sudden awareness of the floor when bare feet meet stone before dawn. These reactions are simple, but they point back toward a time when the sleeping body had fewer layers between itself and the earth. For early humans, the night was not only dark, it was a change in the body's relationship with heat. While moving during the day, muscles produced warmth, hands worked, feet walked, eyes searched. The body could respond quickly to discomfort, but sleep reduced movement. It asked the body to become still, and stillness made the surface beneath it more powerful. A dry surface allowed warmth to remain closer. A wet surface invited heat away slowly. A cold stone, a damp hollow, or a layer of wet plants could make the sleeper feel the world not all at once, but gradually, through pressure and time. This gradualness matters. Ancient discomfort was not always dramatic. It may often have been ordinary, repetitive, and quiet. A person might sleep for a while, wake slightly, turn to the other side, pull closer to another body, shift nearer the fire, adjust a hide, or tuck a child more tightly against the chest. These small movements do not appear clearly in archaeology. They leave no simple monument. Yet they belong to the real history of human sleep as much as tools, bones, or hearths do. The question of dry sleep is therefore not only about shelter. It is about how the body tried to remain warm enough, calm enough, and unbroken enough to continue living. The beginning of humanity was filled with bodies that had to recover without being fully removed from the conditions that exhausted them. A person might spend the day walking through damp grass, crossing wet ground, carrying food, gathering fuel, or searching for a safer place to stop. Then night would come, and the same dampness might still be waiting. There was no clean break between labor and rest. The body that needed sleep was the same body that had been pressed by weather all day. This helps explain why warmth, closeness, and surface mattered so deeply. To sleep beside others was not only emotional, it could be practical. Shared heat softened the night. A child against an adult body gained protection that no dry room yet provided. A group lying close near a fire created a small island of warmth inside a larger world of cold air and wet ground. But even that island had edges. The person nearest the fire might feel smoke. The person farther away might feel damp. The side facing the air might cool while the side against another body warmed. Rest was uneven. Protection was uneven. Dryness, when it existed, was uneven too. Modern comfort often hides this unevenness. It gives each sleeper a separate place, a stable surface, and a predictable layer of warmth. The ancient body lived with fewer guarantees. It had to accept partial solutions. It could not always choose the driest place if the safest place was somewhere else. It could not always choose the softest place if the group needed to stay near water, fuel, animals, or a route they would follow at dawn. This is where the body becomes a record of compromise. Its need for warmth did not disappear. Its need for recovery did not disappear, but those needs had to fit inside the larger demands of movement, weather, children, danger, hunger, and time. So the body learned to rest while still half negotiating with the world. It curled, it shared heat. It woke and settled again. It accepted imperfect ground. It carried sleep through dampness not because dampness was harmless, but because life had not yet built a lasting distance from it. And when we feel discomfort today from a wet sheet, a cold floor, or a blanket that has lost its warmth, we are feeling a small echo of that older condition. The body still knows that sleep becomes harder when the ground, the air, and the skin are not yet at peace. To understand why dry sleep was so difficult for most of human history, we have to look at the world before the bed, before the raised floor, and before the sealed roof. The natural world is not as dry as it appears in daylight. A patch of ground may look firm under the sun, but night changes it. Air cools. Water vapor gathers. Soil releases the dampness it has held. Grass bends under small beads of moisture. Leaves that seemed light and useful can become wet enough to press cold against the skin. Even without heavy rain, the sleeping place can change slowly between sunset and morning. This is one of the quiet problems of ancient rest. Dryness is not only the absence of rain, it is the absence of many smaller forms of water, and in nature those smaller forms are everywhere. A person sleeping under open sky might escape a storm and still wake with damp coverings. A group beneath trees might avoid direct rainfall, yet lie above soil that never fully dried. A rock shelter might block water from above while cold moisture remained in the stone, the air, and the ground. A riverside camp might provide drinking water and food nearby, but the same nearness to water could bring mist, insects, soft soil, and colder air before dawn. The places that helped human survival during the day were not always kind to the body at night. This is why the question of a dry place to sleep cannot be separated from environment. Early humans did not live in a world divided into clean indoor and outdoor spaces. They lived inside climates, seasons, slopes, riverbanks, forests, caves, coastlines, grasslands, wetlands, and cold open ground. Each place offered something and took something away. Trees gave cover, but they held humidity. Caves gave shadow and protection, but they could drip, trap smoke, or keep cold in their walls. Grasslands allowed wider view, but exposed the sleeper to wind and temperature drops. Valleys gathered water. Hillsides drained better, but could be exposed. Near water there was life, but also dampness. Away from water there might be dryness, but also thirst, distance, and effort. The beginning of human life was shaped by these trade-offs. People had to choose places not because they were perfect, but because they were possible. A dry surface for sleep was only one need among many. The group also needed fuel, safety, food, water, visibility, shade, and a route for tomorrow. A place that solved one problem could create another. This made dry sleep unstable. It depended on the season, the last rain, the slope of the ground, the thickness of vegetation, the direction of wind, and the materials available before darkness. The environment did not stay still long enough to become a guaranteed bedroom. In many landscapes, moisture returns at night like a slow visitor. It does not need to fall from the sky. It can rise from the ground, cling to plants, gather on stone, or settle inside a layer of leaves. The sleeping body, because it is still, feels these changes more deeply than the walking body. During the day, movement hides discomfort. At night, stillness reveals it. This is one reason ancient people likely paid close attention to small differences in place. A slightly higher patch of ground could matter. A dry ledge could matter. A thicker layer of grass could matter if it stayed dry and become a problem if it held water. A fire could help, but only within its reach. A shelter could help, but only if the ground below it remained usable. What modern comfort turns into a simple expectation, the ancient world turned into a repeated judgment. Where can the body stop without being slowly taken back by the wet earth? That question followed human beings long before houses made dryness seem normal. Rain is the most obvious reason a sleeping place becomes wet, but it is not the only one, and perhaps not even the most persistent. A storm can pass, a cloud can break, the sky can clear before nightfall, yet the ground may keep the memory of water long after the rain has stopped. Soil holds moisture inside tiny spaces. Roots keep shaded earth from drying too quickly. Fallen leaves can form a soft layer that looks inviting while quietly trapping dampness underneath. In forests, water does not disappear as soon as the weather changes. It lingers in bark, moss, branches, hollows, and shaded ground. In open places, the sun may dry the surface for a few hours, but the return of evening can bring cold air and condensation. So a group of early humans did not need to be caught in heavy rain to face a wet night. They only needed to live in a world where water was part of the land's daily breathing. This is important because the earliest human nights did not happen in one single kind of place. Our ancestors and relatives lived across changing environments over long spans of time. Some groups slept near rivers because water drew animals, plants, and movement. Some used rock shelters when they were available. Some rested under trees, near open grasslands, along seasonal routes, or in places chosen for fuel, visibility, or safety. Each setting had its own way of holding moisture. Riverbanks could be useful by day and cold by dawn. Caves could shield the body from direct weather, while keeping a damp chill in their stone. Forest floors could provide leaves and cover, while keeping the ground dark and humid. Open ground might dry faster, but it could offer less protection from wind, and wind can make a slightly damp body feel much colder. There was no perfect environment waiting for the sleeper. There were only different balances of risk, warmth, dryness, and need. The search for a dry place to sleep was therefore never only a search for a dry surface. It was a search inside an entire system. If the group moved uphill to escape wet ground, they might become more exposed. If they stayed near trees, the air might remain damp. If they slept near a fire, they gained warmth. But smoke, sparks, fuel limits, and shifting wind became part of the night. If they chose a sheltered hollow, rainwater might run toward it later. If they slept on a slope, the body might stay drier but rest less easily. Every answer contained another question. This is one reason the modern idea of a place to sleep can mislead us. We imagine a fixed space whose purpose is rest. In much of deep human history, a sleeping place was only a temporary pause in a moving life. It was chosen after the demands of the day had already shaped what was possible. The beginning of human life was not arranged around comfort first. It was arranged around water, food, fire, movement, children, danger, and season. Dryness had to fit among those needs. Sometimes it may have been found for a night, sometimes only partly, sometimes not at all. A bed is dry because a whole chain of inventions stands beneath it. Roof, wall, floor, drainage, stored materials, woven coverings, and a settled place to return to. Before that chain became ordinary, dryness depended on much smaller things. A raised root, a patch of sand, a ledge beneath stone, a layer of grass that had not yet soaked through, a fire placed well enough to dry one side of the body. The difference between a tolerable night and a miserable one could be narrow, and because the natural world keeps changing after sunset, even the best choice could weaken before morning. The dampness of ancient sleep was not always a disaster. Often, it was simply the ordinary pressure of living close to the earth. It reminds us that dry rest is not just a comfort. It is a distance from the landscape that humans had to build slowly. The more closely we look at ancient sleep, the less dryness appears as a simple condition. It was not a thing people either had or did not have. It was a moving border. A place might be dry enough for the first hour of night, then damp after mist settled. It might be dry near the fire, but wet where the body's feet reached beyond the warmed ground. It might be dry on the surface, while the cold beneath it still rose slowly through leaves, grass, hide, or skin. In nature, water does not only arrive as weather, it remains as memory. It remains in soil after rain, in shaded roots after daylight, in the breath of plants, in the stone of caves, in the fog of river valleys, and in the cold that gathers where the ground lies low. For a human body trying to sleep, These small forms of wetness could matter more than a single storm because they were repeated, ordinary, and difficult to remove. This is why the early history of sleep belongs so strongly to place. A group could not simply decide that night would be dry. They had to read the land before darkness. They had to notice where water would run, where air would settle, where smoke might drift, where the fire could be fed, where children could be kept close, and where the body could lie without losing too much warmth before morning. The beginning of human life was full of these quiet decisions. They were not always dramatic enough to become stories, but they shaped every evening. The land offered clues, and the body paid for mistakes. If the group chose a hollow, the hollow might protect them from wind, but it could also collect cold air and water. If they chose higher ground, it might drain better, but the wind might pass over it without mercy. If they chose a place under trees, branches might soften rain, but leaves and soil might stay damp long after open ground had dried. If they chose stone, it might feel solid and safe, yet hold a deep chill through the night. Each place carried two meanings at once. Shelter and exposure were often mixed together. This made dry sleep uncertain, even for people who knew their surroundings well. Knowledge helped, but knowledge did not turn a wet season into a dry one. It did not remove fog from a valley or warmth from the needs of a tired body. It did not make every camp a home. Modern buildings hide this uncertainty by controlling many things at once. A roof separates rain from the sleeper. A floor separates the body from soil. Walls reduce wind. Bedding creates layers of trapped warmth. Drainage moves water away before it becomes part of the bed. But for most of human history, these protections either did not exist or existed only in partial, temporary forms. A branch shelter could fail. A hide could become wet. A fire could fade. A layer of plants could compress under the body and lose its usefulness. A rock overhang could protect one side while leaving another open. Dryness had to be made again and again, with whatever the land allowed. This gives the title its deeper weight. The question is not only why ancient people lacked dry beds, it is why human sleep spent so much time inside a world that refused to stay separate from the body. The answer will not come from one invention or one moment. It lies in a long relationship between moving people and changing ground. Before humans could build stable dry rooms, they had to sleep in places that were useful for life, not perfect for rest. Near water, near food, near fuel, near others, near tomorrow's path, these needs shaped the night before comfort could. So the sleeping place was often a compromise between what kept the group alive and what allowed the body to loosen. Sometimes that compromise was dry enough. Often it was only partly dry. And across deep time, partly dry may have been the ordinary condition of human sleep. Before strong roofs, sealed walls and floors that stayed above the soil, human shelter was often a temporary answer to a temporary problem. A few branches leaned together could slow the wind. A sheet of bark could break some falling rain. A hide stretched over a frame could make a darker, warmer pocket in the night. A rock ledge could hold back the sky from one direction. A circle near fire could create a small region where damp air felt less powerful. But none of these early protections should be imagined as a complete room. They were not firm boundaries between the body and nature. They were small interruptions in exposure. They reduced the touch of weather without removing it. The sleeping body was still close to soil, stone, smoke, insects, wet leaves, and the slow cooling of the earth after sunset. This is the important difference between shelter and dryness. A shelter can protect from one thing while leaving another thing untouched. It can stop direct rain, but not ground moisture. It can block wind, but hold smoke. It can keep warmth near the body for a while, but fail before morning. It can feel safe at dusk and damp by dawn. For much of human history, protection probably worked in these partial ways. People did not need to be without intelligence or skill for their nights to remain wet. They could know the land, choose carefully, gather materials, maintain fire, and still be limited by what the place, season, and weather allowed. The beginning of human life was not a world without shelter. It was a world before shelter became stable enough to make dryness ordinary. A group moving through a landscape could not always carry a full structure. What they carried instead was knowledge. Which branches bend well, which grasses dry faster, which bark sheds water, which hollow is dangerous after rain, which slope drains, which stone ledge gives shade but also keeps cold. This knowledge mattered. It could make the difference between a night of constant waking and a night that allowed some deeper rest. But knowledge had to work with materials that decayed, soaked, tore, smoked, shifted, or had to be left behind. A covering made from plants might be useful for a short time, then become heavy with moisture. A bedding layer of leaves or grass might lift the body slightly, then flatten under weight. A hide might hold warmth, but if wet, it could carry cold close to the skin. Branches might make a roof shape, but rain could still pass through gaps, run down supports, or gather at the edges. These were not failures in a modern sense. They were the normal limits of living close to the ground. The ancient sleeping place was often built from the same world that made it uncomfortable. Leaves softened the body but held dampness. Wood fed the fire but created smoke. Stone gave cover but kept cold. Earth supported the camp but pulled heat away. Even fire, the most powerful helper of the night, did not erase these limits. It created a warm side and a cold side. It dried what was near and left the edges unchanged. It demanded fuel, attention, and placement. A shelter near fire had to consider smoke and sparks. A shelter far from fire lost warmth. In this way, every protection created a new arrangement, not a final solution. Dry sleep remained something made by balance rather than guaranteed by construction. This helps explain why the history of sleeping dry is not simply the history of inventing a roof. A roof alone is not enough if the ground below stays wet. A covering is not enough if the air remains cold and humid. A wall is not enough if water runs beneath it. Long before permanent houses, humans may have made many clever, practical local shelters, but most of them were closer to a pause in the weather than an escape from it. They gave the body a little more time, a little more warmth, a little more separation from rain or wind, and for a tired human being, that little distance mattered. It may have helped a child sleep longer, an elder lose less heat, or a group remain gathered through the darker hours, but it did not yet turn the night into a dry indoor space. It only made the open world slightly more survivable. A temporary shelter is easy to imagine as a small beginning of the house, but that can make the ancient night too neat. A few branches, skins, leaves, reeds, grasses, or stones did not automatically create a separate human world. They created a surface of delay. Rain might slow before reaching the body. Wind might lose some force. Warmth might remain near the fire a little longer. The eyes might feel less exposed beneath a low roof of branches or under the dark curve of a rock. Yet the sleeper was still lying inside the weather's reach. Moisture could rise from below even when it did not fall from above. Cold could move through the ground. Smoke could drift under the covering. Water could collect along the edge of a hide or drip from leaves long after the rain itself had stopped. The shelter helped, but it did not fully close the world. This is why the early history of dry sleep has to be understood through layers, not walls. A body might have one layer of grass beneath it, another layer of hide above it, another layer of warmth from another body nearby, and a circle of heat from a fire. Each layer reduced one problem while leaving others behind. Grass softened stone or soil, but if the grass was damp, it brought the wetness closer. Hides held warmth, but they were not magic barriers against every kind of weather. Leaves could shed some rain, but they could also trap mist. A shallow pit could block wind, but it might gather water. A place close to a fire could dry one side of the body while the other side remained open to cold air. These small limits were not rare accidents. They were part of the ordinary design of sleeping before fixed architecture. At the beginning of human life, people did not yet have a permanent dry platform waiting for them each night. What they had was a changing relationship with material. The same branch that made a roof could bend under water. The same bark that covered a gap could crack or shift. The same plant fibers that made a resting surface could decay. The same stone that protected from rain could hold chill deep into the night. A shelter made from living landscape was never fully separate from that landscape. It carried the forest, riverbank, grassland, cave, or cold open ground into the place of sleep. This made rest more skilled than passive. Someone had to notice what would drain, what would soak, what would burn, what would smoke, what would dry, what could be repaired, and what was not worth carrying onward. In a mobile life, the cost of shelter also mattered. A heavy covering might protect well but slow movement. A structure built carefully might be useful for a few nights, then abandoned when food, water, season or danger moved the group elsewhere. A dry place was therefore not only a technical problem, it was a problem of time and energy. How much effort should be spent on one night? How long would the camp last? Would rain come? Would the fire hold? Were there children, elders, or injured people who needed the better place under cover? The sleeping surface was shaped by these human questions as much as by the weather itself. This is where the ancient shelter becomes more than an object. It becomes a sign of care, judgment, and compromise. A group might place the most vulnerable bodies where warmth was strongest or dampness was least. Adults might accept the colder edge. A covering might be shared unevenly. The driest patch might not be large enough for everyone. In that kind of night, dryness was not a private possession. It was something distributed across the group imperfectly, according to need. Modern sleep often hides this social layer because each person may have a separate bed, separate blanket, and separate protected space. But before dry rooms became ordinary, the question of where the body slept was also a question of who received the best part of a fragile shelter. The old night was not just wet ground and cold air. It was a community arranging itself around limited protection, trying to make a small human island inside a world that still belonged to weather. A shelter becomes meaningful because the body knows how little it takes for sleep to fail. One opening in the wrong direction can let wind move across the face for hours. One low place in the ground can hold water after a brief rain. One damp layer beneath the hip can make warmth leave slowly, even when the upper body is covered. This is why the earliest forms of shelter should not be imagined as simple inventions that solved the night. They were more like negotiations. A branch leaned against another branch. A hide pulled tighter. A fire moved slightly closer. A child placed nearer the center. A layer of grass added beneath the ribs. A stone ledge chosen not because it was comfortable, but because it was less exposed than open ground. Each small act pushed the night back a little, but the night remained present. The beginning of human sleep was shaped by this nearness. The weather was not outside. It was at the edge of the covering, under the body, in the smoke, in the cold air, and in the materials gathered from the land itself. Even the best temporary shelter carried uncertainty. A roof made from branches could sound comforting when rain first touched it, then begin to leak as water found narrow paths. Leaves might turn the first drops aside, then become heavy and cold. A hide might protect one sleeper well but leave another at the edge. A low wall of stones might break the wind near the fire, while the back of the body still felt the wet ground. The human group could improve the night, but not command it. This difference matters deeply for the question of dry sleep. A modern house works because many problems have been solved together. Water is carried away, the floor is raised, the roof is sealed, the walls hold, the bed lifts the body, and dry coverings wait inside. In the older world, these protections appeared separately, unevenly, and often temporarily. One night might have a good overhang but poor ground. Another might have dry grass but no real windbreak. Another might have fire and warmth but smoke trapped under cover. Another might offer a dry surface for a few people, but not for the whole group. Dryness was not yet a complete environment. It was a brief advantage inside a larger exposure. This also means that ancient comfort was probably measured differently. It may not have meant softness, privacy, or silence. It may have meant a place where the body lost less heat, where the ground did not soak through too quickly, where the fire could be kept alive, where the most vulnerable could rest closer to warmth, and where the group could wake with enough strength to move again. The first human nights were tied to the next human morning. Shelter was judged by whether people could continue. A wet night could make the body tired before the day began. A colder night could make joints stiffer, muscles slower, children more restless, elders more fragile. A slightly drier place might not feel pleasant by modern standards, but in deep time it could have been a real gift. It gave the body a little more recovery. It gave the group a little more patience. It allowed sleep to deepen for a while before the earth and air reminded the sleeper of their presence. The long movement toward dry sleep did not begin with luxury. It began with these modest gains: a better layer, a better slope, a better use of fire, a better memory of which camp worked after rain, a better understanding of how water moved across land. The human body did not leap from open ground to bedroom. It crossed thousands of small thresholds, each one making the night slightly less exposed. But for most of that journey, the sleeper still remained close to damp soil, cold stone, wet plants, and shelters that could only partly hold back the weather. That is why a dry place to sleep was not simply missing, it had to be invented slowly, through repeated nights when the body learned exactly what the ground could take away. Fire changed the night, but it did not remove the ground. This is easy to forget, because in the modern imagination fire often appears as the great answer to ancient darkness. It brings light, it brings warmth, it gathers people into a circle, it pushes some animals away. It lets food change, it gives the human face a glow in the dark that feels almost like the beginning of home. But even with fire, the sleeping body still had to lie somewhere. Warmth rose and moved. Smoke drifted, sparks died, ash cooled. The earth beneath the body remained earth. If it was damp before the flames were built, it did not automatically become dry all the way through. If cold lived deep in stone or soil, fire might warm the surface for a while, but the night was longer than a flame's first brightness. This is why fire must be understood carefully. It was one of the most important helpers humans ever learned to use, yet it was not the same thing as a dry room. Around a fire, the ancient sleeping place became more survivable, not fully controlled. A person could move closer to warmth, turn one side toward heat, dry a covering, harden damp ground near the flames, or hold a child where the air felt less cold. The group could sit together longer after sunset. They could see one another. They could listen beyond the light. They could create a small center in a world that otherwise belonged to darkness. But the circle of fire had limits. The back of the body could remain cold while the front warmed. The feet might lie beyond the strongest heat. The ground under the sleeper might still pull warmth away. If a person moved too close, smoke and sparks became problems. If they moved too far, damp air returned. The beginning of human rest near fire was therefore not a perfect comfort, but a balance between heat, smoke, fuel, and the body's need to let go. Fire also demanded attention. It did not protect the sleeper without being fed. Wood had to be found. Fuel had to be dry enough to burn. Someone had to notice when the flame weakened. In wet weather, fire could become more difficult to maintain. In open wind, it could shift and scatter. Under a shelter, it could fill the space with smoke. Inside a cave or beneath a rock overhang, it could bring warmth while also changing the air. Fire solved one part of the night and complicated another. That is part of its deep human meaning. It did not separate people from nature. It gave them a tool for negotiating with nature more powerfully. For the sleeping body, this negotiation was physical. Heat from fire could make dampness less punishing, but only within reach. A hide could be dried near flames, but later gather moisture again. Wet grass could steam, then cool. Ash could form a warmer layer in some places, but ash alone was not a bed. A hearth could mark the center of a camp. Yet the outer edges of that camp remained exposed to wet ground, wind, insects, and cold air. The ancient night was not transformed evenly. It became patchy, warm here, cold there, dry for a moment, damp again before morning. This patchiness matters because human sleep needs more than a bright center. It needs duration. It needs the body to stay warm enough for hours. It needs enough trust for muscles to soften and breathing to slow. Fire gave humans a way to push back against the night, but it could not make the entire sleeping place stable. The oldest human nights were probably shaped by this flickering boundary. Close to the flames, the body felt one world. A few steps away, it felt another. Between them was the long effort to rest without ever fully escaping the wet earth. Fire made the night more human, but it also made the limits of the night easier to see. Around the flames, people could gather in a shape that was not given by the landscape alone. The circle of light created a center. Faces could be seen, hands could work a little longer, food could be warmed, wet materials could be placed near heat. Children could be held in the warmer air. The group could listen from inside a small brightness while darkness remained beyond it. In that sense, fire changed sleep before people even lay down. it gave the evening a structure. It allowed the group to prepare, to choose positions, to dry what could be dried, and to feel, for a while, that the night had been pushed back. But pushed back is not the same as defeated. A fire does not warm every surface equally. It does not lift the body from the soil. It does not stop moisture from rising under a layer of leaves. It does not prevent rain from reaching the camp unless other shelter is present. It does not keep burning without fuel. It creates an island, and islands have edges. The body sleeping near fire would have known those edges through sensation. One side of the body might face warmth, while the other side cooled. A covering might feel dry near the flames, then damp again where it touched the ground. A person might shift closer and meet smoke, sparks, or too much heat, then shift away and meet the cold again. The warmth of fire could make rest possible, but not simple. It created choices. Where should the body lie? How near is near enough? Who should be closest? Where will smoke go if the wind changes? Is the ground there dry, or only warmed on top? These are quiet questions, but they belong to the beginning of human sleep. The fire did not remove the ancient problem of wet ground. It made that problem manageable for a time, and sometimes that time may have been enough. A damp hide could be turned toward the heat. Grass could be dried before being used as bedding. A patch of soil might become less cold near the hearth. Ash and warmed earth could hold a little comfort after flames weakened. Yet, water has patience. If the ground beneath remained saturated, warmth near the surface could fade. If mist gathered before dawn, coverings could cool again. If rain returned, the fire itself might become fragile. In a world without sealed roofs, even the best fire was working against a larger atmosphere. This is why the history of dry sleep cannot be told as if fire solved everything. Fire was a helper, a tool, a companion, and sometimes a boundary. But it did not create the full separation that a floor, a wall, a roof, and a raised bed would later create together. It belonged to a moving life, where people still had to collect fuel, judge wind, choose camps, protect children, and wake when conditions changed. At the origin of human life, warmth was not stored in a room. It had to be made again, watched again, and guarded against dampness again. This may be one reason fire became so closely tied to human gathering. It did more than heat the air. It gave the group a reason to stay close, and closeness itself became another layer of protection. Bodies near one another shared warmth that fire alone could not hold evenly. A sleeping child near an adult, an elder placed nearer the centre, a tired person turned toward the coals. These arrangements show how fire and community work together. Dryness, warmth, and safety were not separate comforts. They were woven into the same nightly act of staying alive. Still, the old wet earth remained beneath them, waiting at the edge of every flame. Fire may have been the closest thing ancient people had to a moving hearth, but even a hearth is not a bed. It gives heat to the air, light to the eyes, and a centre to the group, yet the body still needs a surface beneath it. That surface may be the real secret of this question. A person can warm the hands and face near flames while the hip still presses into cold ground. A child can sleep in the circle of adults while moisture still gathers in the bedding below. A hide can be dried beside the fire and still become damp again where it meets earth. The fire changes the upper world of the sleeper more easily than the lower world. It warms breath, skin, and shadow. But the ground has its own coldness, and the ground does not disappear because light is above it. This is why the ancient night was often divided. Above the body there might be warmth, smoke, and flickering light. Beneath the body there might be soil, stone, ash, roots, flattened grass, or damp leaves. Between those two worlds lay the human body, trying to rest. Fire helped people survive that division, but it did not erase it. If the group had enough fuel, the circle could remain warmer for longer. If the wood was wet, the fire might smoke more than it burned. If rain came, the flames might shrink. If wind shifted, warmth moved away, and smoke moved towards sleeping faces. If the fire was placed under shelter, it could help dry the space, but it could also make the air difficult to breathe. Every advantage carried another limit. This was not failure. It was the ordinary condition of using a powerful tool inside an uncontrolled world. At the beginning of human life, fire did not create a sealed human space. It created a temporary center inside a landscape that still had authority. The old question remained under the body: is this ground dry enough to let sleep deepen? Sometimes the answer may have been almost yes. The earth near an old hearth could hold warmth. Ash might create a softer, drier patch than raw soil. Stones heated earlier could give off warmth for a while. Bedding placed near coals might feel better than bedding placed far from them. A group that understood fire well could improve the night in many small ways. But almost yes is not the same as guaranteed. Firelight fades, coals cool, dawn brings damp air. The body shifts during sleep and may roll away from the warmest place. A larger group cannot all sleep at the perfect distance from the flames. Someone lies at the edge. Someone receives more smoke. Someone feels more cold from behind. Dryness and warmth are distributed unevenly, just as shelter is distributed unevenly. This unevenness is part of the real history of human rest. It reminds us that sleep was not only an individual act. It was organized around the group, the fire, the ground, and the weather at the same time. Fire gave humans a way to lengthen the evening and soften the danger of darkness. But dry sleep required more than heat. It required separation from wet soil. It required a surface that would not steal warmth for hours. It required coverings that stayed useful until morning. It required a place where water moved away instead of gathering below. Those things came slowly, through repeated knowledge, better shelters, raised surfaces, more stable camps, and eventually built homes. Fire stands in the middle of that long path. It was not the final answer to the wet night, but it taught humans something essential. The environment could be changed, even if only for a few hours. The darkness could be pushed back, dampness could be reduced, cold could be negotiated. A small circle of warmth could exist where none had existed before. But beyond that circle, and often beneath it, the earth remained close. For most of human history, people did not sleep in a world made dry by walls. They slept near fire, near one another and near the ground, carrying warmth through the night without fully escaping the wetness below. Archaeology gives us stones, bones, ash, tools, hearths, post holes, shells, pigments, broken edges, and the harder remains of human life. It gives us the places where people returned, the animals they ate, the fire they kept, the tools they shaped, and sometimes the floors they used. But it rarely gives us the full feeling of a night. Wetness is difficult to preserve. A damp hide disappears. A layer of leaves decays. Grass bedding rots back into soil. The smell of smoke mixed with wet earth leaves no simple outline. The cold that rose through a sleeper's hip does not become a fossil. This is one reason the history of dry sleep is so hard to see directly. The most important discomforts of ancient rest were often made from things that vanish. When we look back, we must be careful. We cannot say exactly how every group slept, or how wet every night was, or what every shelter felt like from the inside. But we can say that the evidence left behind is incomplete in a very specific way. It preserves many hard things, while the soft, damp, temporary parts of sleep are often lost. This absence matters. If a person slept on leaves, bark, grass, reeds, hides, or plant fibers, those materials might leave only faint traces, if any. If they arranged bedding near a fire, the hearth might remain, but the posture of the sleepers would not. If a shelter kept off some rain for a few nights and was then abandoned, its light frame might disappear entirely. If people chose a rock shelter because it was less wet than the open ground, later sediments might tell us something about occupation, but not the exact comfort of lying there before dawn. The beginning of human sleep is therefore partly hidden behind decay. We see the durable outline of life, while the fragile surface of rest has mostly gone. Still, the traces that remain can guide us. Hearths show where fire was used repeatedly. Burned sediments show places where heat changed the ground. Stone tools and animal bones show camps where people worked, cooked, ate, and perhaps slept nearby. In some sites, archaeologists have found signs that plant materials may have been used as bedding or floor covering, though such evidence is rare and depends on unusual preservation. These hints are important because they show that people were not simply lying anywhere without thought. They arranged spaces, they returned to certain places. They used materials between the body and the ground when conditions allowed, yet the rarity of these traces also reminds us how little of ancient sleep survives. A dry night and a damp night may leave almost the same silence in the earth. The human body, however, would have known the difference. A thin layer of plants could raise the body slightly, ash might reduce insects or soften a surface. A hearth could warm a sleeping area for a time. A rock wall could block wind, but none of these traces automatically means a dry room. They point instead to small acts of managing the ground. They show humans trying to shape the place where the body stopped. That effort itself belongs to the deep origin of our species. Long before architecture became heavy and permanent, people were already changing the immediate surface of life. They were making fires, clearing spaces, laying down materials, choosing sheltered spots, and turning the wild ground into something slightly more bearable. Archaeology can show the marks of these actions, but it cannot fully show the wetness they were answering. It cannot easily show the night after rain, the morning mist, the cold edge of a cave floor, or the moment a sleeping person shifted away from damp soil. So when we ask why so much of human history had no dry place to sleep, we are asking a question that lies partly inside the gaps of evidence. The hard remains tell us where people lived. The missing soft remains ask us to imagine what their bodies had to endure there. A hearth in the ground can look simple when it is uncovered thousands of years later. A dark patch of sediment, a cluster of burned stones, a layer of ash, a few bones with heat marks, a scatter of tools nearby. To the archaeologist, these things can suggest use, return, food, fire, and human presence. But to the sleeping body, that same place would have been more than evidence. It would have been warmth in one direction, smoke in another, damp soil beneath, perhaps a wall of stone nearby, perhaps open air beyond the circle. This difference between what remains and what was felt is important. The earth records human life unevenly. It remembers fire better than cold. It remembers stone better than grass. It remembers bone better than a damp covering. So the archaeological record can show that people made places more livable, while still hiding how fragile those places were at night. A campsite with repeated fires may suggest that people returned because the location offered something useful: water, shelter, food routes, raw material, or protection from wind. But usefulness is not the same as dryness. A place can be valuable and still uncomfortable. A cave or rock shelter can preserve tools, bones, and hearths because sediment gathered there over time, but the same shelter may also have had dripping ceilings, smoky air, cold stone, damp corners, or uneven floors. A site near a river can preserve traces of activity while also reminding us that water, mist, and soft ground were part of the setting. A place chosen again and again may have been the best available option, not an ideal home. This is one of the quiet lessons of archaeology. Human beings often lived with partial solutions. They did not wait for perfect comfort before making a place useful. They worked with what the land allowed. Some rare discoveries help us see the softer side of ancient shelter more clearly. In certain preserved contexts, traces of plant bedding, grass layers, ash, or prepared surfaces suggest that people sometimes placed material between themselves and the ground. Such evidence is valuable because it points to care, planning, and bodily knowledge. A person who lays down grass is not ignoring the ground. A person who chooses ash, leaves, or plant matter is trying to change the way the body meets the earth. These acts may seem small, but they belong directly to the question of dry sleep. They show that early humans understood that the surface mattered. The problem is that such materials usually vanish. Their absence from many sites does not mean they were never used. It means the oldest sleeping places were made from things that time easily eats. At the beginning of human life, many nightly arrangements may have disappeared without leaving a clear signature. A branch frame rots, a hide decomposes, reeds flatten and return to soil, leaves break down, bark crumbles, smoke fades. The warmth that once made a place tolerable leaves no shape after the hearth cools. Archaeology, therefore, gives us a kind of shadow image. We see the durable edges of behavior, not always the living texture of the night. Still, the pattern is meaningful. Hearths, shelters, prepared floors, and repeated occupation sites. tell us that humans were not only surviving in landscapes, they were modifying small parts of those landscapes again and again. But those modifications remained close to the earth. They did not yet create the kind of dry separation that modern sleep depends on. A prepared floor could still be cold, bedding could still become damp, a sheltered site could still be humid, a fire could still die before dawn. The evidence points not to comfort already achieved, but to comfort being slowly attempted. That may be the most honest way to read the traces. Ancient people were not passive sleepers on raw ground, and they were not already living in dry rooms. They were somewhere between those two ideas, using skill, memory, fire, and material to make the night less harsh. The ground kept much of its power, but the human hand had begun to answer it. The most honest way to use archaeology is to let it speak, but not force it to say more than it can. The traces of ancient life are real, yet they are partial. A hearth can tell us that fire burned in a place. It cannot tell us exactly who woke in the night, because smoke shifted. A layer of plant material can suggest that people prepared a surface. It cannot tell us whether that surface stayed dry until dawn. A rock shelter can show long use across generations. It cannot make every night inside it warm, clean, or comfortable. This matters because the question of dry sleep lives partly in what disappeared. The wet leaf, the cold hide, the flattened grass, the damp ash, the tired body turning away from a colder patch of ground. These things belong to real human nights, but they rarely survive as clear evidence. What remains is often the frame around the experience, not the experience itself. We should not imagine ancient people as helpless, lying wherever the day ended. The evidence suggests the opposite. Humans repeatedly shaped their surroundings, used fire, returned to useful places, prepared surfaces, and carried knowledge from one night to the next. But we should also not turn every trace of shelter into a modern bedroom in miniature. A prepared surface was not necessarily a dry floor. A hearth was not necessarily a warm room. A cave was not necessarily a safe house. The deep past sits between these extremes. It shows people with intelligence, skill, care, and memory, living in conditions where the ground still had the final word far more often than it does today. At the beginning of human life, the sleeping place was probably not a single object. It was a combination of things: a location chosen before darkness, a fire placed with care, materials gathered under pressure, bodies arranged near one another, and a memory of how the same place had behaved before. Archaeology can catch some parts of that combination. It may preserve the fire, the stone tool, the animal bone, the stained sediment, the worn surface, or the protected corner of a shelter. But the most bodily part of sleep, whether the back stayed warm, whether the covering became damp, whether the child woke cold, whether the old person found a less painful place for the hip, is usually gone. This absence should make the story quieter, not weaker. It reminds us that human history is not made only of large inventions and visible monuments. It is also made of small nightly adjustments that left almost no trace. A better patch of ground, a thicker layer of plants, a body moved closer to coals, a child placed between adults, a campsite avoided after water gathered there once before, a rock ledge remembered because it stayed less wet than the open land. These are not dramatic discoveries, but they are part of the slow road toward dry sleep. They show a species learning to read the earth not only for food and danger, but for rest. The difficulty is that the earth preserves the answer unevenly. It lets us see that humans tried to make sleeping places more bearable. It does not always let us see how often those places failed. A site may look orderly when excavated, and still have held countless damp mornings. A hearth may look stable in the ground and still have belonged to nights when warmth faded too soon. The record is not silent, but it is incomplete. So the question remains open in a careful way. Why did so much of human history have no dry place to sleep? Part of the answer lies not only in what ancient people lacked, but in what time has erased. The soft, wet, temporary layers where the body met the earth and tried, again, to rest. A dry place becomes easier to keep when people can return to it, repair it, raise it, and protect it over time. This is one of the reasons mobility matters so much. For much of human history, many human groups lived by moving through landscapes rather than staying permanently in one built place. Movement did not mean wandering without knowledge. It often meant following seasons, water, animals, plants, fuel, safer routes, and remembered places. But even skilled movement creates a limit. If a group is not staying long, a sleeping place cannot always become a permanent structure. It may be improved for a night, or several nights, or a season, but it must remain tied to the needs of travel. What cannot be carried must be left behind. What takes too much effort may not be worth building. What works in dry weather may fail when the season changes. This gives the old question a new shape. Humans did not lack dry sleep, only because they lacked ideas. Often the problem was that life itself kept moving. A group might know how to choose a better slope, gather grass, use hides, arrange branches, or sleep near stone that blocked wind. They might remember which places stayed less wet after rain. They might return to camps that had worked before. But if food moved, if animals migrated, if water sources changed, if cold increased, if plants ripened somewhere else, then the group had to move too. The sleeping place could not always be defended against time. In a settled life, one can improve the same floor again and again. In a mobile life, effort is spread across many nights and many landscapes. The result is not ignorance, but impermanence. At the beginning of human life, shelter was often something made in relation to the next movement. It had to be useful without becoming a burden. A heavy frame, a thick roof, a raised platform, or a large dry structure might have helped sleep, but only if the group could remain there long enough to justify the work. If tomorrow required travel, then the best shelter was often the one that could be made quickly, repaired easily, or abandoned without losing too much. This is why the ground stayed so important. The land itself had to provide much of the sleeping place. A ledge, a dry patch, a tree line, a slope, a cave mouth, a sandy rise, a cluster of stones, a place where plants could be gathered. Human skill could improve these places, but it rarely transformed them completely. Mobility also meant that every new camp reopened the same question. Where is the driest ground tonight? Where will water run if rain comes? Where will smoke go? Where can children sleep? Where can the group stay close? Where is the fuel? Where is the water for morning? These questions did not appear once and disappear. They returned with each stop. A bed in a house is a repeated answer. A mobile camp is a repeated question. That difference is central to why dry sleep took so long to become ordinary. The body needed the same things each night, but the land answered differently each time. One night might offer a rock overhang. Another might offer only damp grass. Another might require staying near a river because thirst mattered more than dryness. Another might require sleeping in wind because the open view felt safer. In that world, the dry place was not a destination already built. It was a momentary agreement between movement, weather, memory, and need. Human beings carried their intelligence with them, but they could not carry a permanent dry room across deep time. A moving life does not mean a careless life. It may require even more attention than a settled one. When a group cannot depend on the same walls each night, memory becomes a kind of shelter. People remember which valley holds fog before sunrise, which riverbank becomes mud after rain, which grove offers branches but keeps the ground damp, which rise dries faster in wind, which cave mouth feels protected but traps smoke, which old camp is worth returning to when the season turns again. This knowledge is quiet, practical, and accumulated through many bodies over many nights. It is not written down. It is carried in stories, habits, paths, gestures, and the way older people choose a place before younger ones fully understand why. Yet even deep memory cannot make every stop dry. It can only improve the odds. The land still changes. A stream shifts. A storm arrives late. Animals move elsewhere. A safe place becomes crowded, flooded, cold, or too far from food. In that kind of life, the sleeping place is never only about sleep. It is connected to the whole pattern of survival. A camp might be chosen because water is near, even if the ground is damp. Another might be chosen because fuel is available, even if wind is strong. Another might be chosen because it gives a view across open land, even if the sleeper feels exposed to cold. The group may accept a wet night because the morning will bring food or safety or movement along a known route. This is difficult for a modern mind because a bedroom has one clear purpose. It exists for rest. But in deep human time, the place of sleep often had many purposes at once. It was a place to stop, cook, watch, nurse, repair tools, share warmth, protect children and prepare to move again. Dryness mattered deeply, but it rarely stood alone. At the beginning of human life, every shelter decision had to fit inside the larger question of what the group could carry. A raised sleeping platform might separate the body from wet ground, but building one again and again would demand time, material, and energy. A thick roof might shed rain, but it might be too heavy or too slow to construct for a brief stop. More bedding might help, but wet bedding becomes a burden if it must be carried the next day. Hides, plant fibre, bark, or woven material can protect the body, but they also have weight, limits, and uses beyond sleep. Nothing exists only as comfort when survival is uncertain. A covering may be needed for warmth, carrying, wrapping, shade, or protection from rain. A group must decide, again and again, how much effort to spend on a night that may be left behind by morning. This is why mobility kept the body close to the ground, not because humans could not imagine better rest, but because life kept asking them to balance rest against movement. A dry place is easiest to maintain when the future is expected to remain nearby. When tomorrow belongs somewhere else, the night becomes more provisional. The fire is made, the materials are gathered, the bodies settle, the damp edges are endured, and then the place is left. Some traces may remain: ash, bones, stone flakes, a darkened patch of soil, but the shelter itself may return to the landscape. The next group, or the same group in another season, may find it changed. Rain may have taken it, plants may have grown over it, animals may have disturbed it. The old sleeping place was never fully owned. It was borrowed. Across most of human history, this borrowed quality shaped the meaning of rest. People slept where survival allowed them to pause, not always where the body would have chosen for comfort. A dry night could happen, but it could not be guaranteed by return, repair, and permanence in the way later houses made possible. The moving human body carried memory, skill, fire, and social care, but each evening it still had to ask the land a new question. The deeper we follow mobile life, the clearer it becomes that a dry sleeping place was not only a matter of shelter, it was a matter of staying long enough for shelter to improve. A floor becomes better when people can return to it, clear it, raise it, drain it, repair it, and remember its weaknesses. A roof becomes stronger when people have time to thicken it. A camp becomes drier when people can observe where water moves through many storms. But in a life shaped by movement, many sleeping places never had that chance. They were used, adjusted, warmed, shared, and then left behind. The next night might belong to another slope, another tree line, another patch of open ground, another rock shelter, another riverbank, another answer that was only partly successful. This did not make human life simple or primitive. It made it deeply responsive. People had to live by reading change. They moved because the world itself moved. Herds shifted, fruits ripened and vanished. Water rose or dried. Cold returned. Insects gathered. Fuel became scarce. Danger changed shape, and seasons opened one path while closing another. To sleep in such a world was to pause inside motion, not to stop history. The body wanted recovery, but the group had to remain ready for tomorrow. A place too wet might still be chosen if it kept people near water. A place too cold might still be chosen if it gave visibility. A place too exposed might still be chosen if the ground was firmer. A place with better shelter might be left because food had moved away. This is why the ancient sleeping place cannot be judged by comfort alone. It belonged to a wider web of decisions. At the beginning of human life, rest was tied to movement so closely that the ground beneath the sleeper was often only a temporary partner. It held the body for a few hours, then released it back into travel. Human beings may have returned to familiar places across seasons, and some sites may have been used again and again, but return is not the same as permanent control. A remembered camp could still be wet after unusual rain. A useful shelter could still become smoky, crowded, cold, or damaged. A good place in one season could become a poor place in another. The land was not a fixed bedroom waiting to be unlocked. It was alive with change. This constant change helps explain why dry sleep became ordinary only after many other things slowly gathered around human life. More stable camps, stronger shelter, stored materials, raised surfaces, better control of water, more settled patterns, and eventually houses that could be repaired over time. Dryness required continuity. It required people to invest in the same place, not only in the next night. Before that, humans carried what they could: fire knowledge, tools, coverings, memory, and the warmth of the group. These were powerful, but they were not walls. They could soften the night, not fully remove it. The moving camp remained open to damp soil, mist, weather, and the changing needs of survival. This gives the question of dry sleep a calmer, deeper meaning. It was not that ancient people failed to notice discomfort. They knew it through the body more directly than we do. They knew cold ground, wet bedding, smoke, wind, and the value of a slightly better place. But knowing discomfort is not the same as escaping it. For most of human history, the human body slept close to the earth because life itself had not yet become fixed enough to lift sleep away from the earth every night. The sleeper was part of a moving group, inside a moving landscape, under a moving sky. Dryness could be found, improved, and remembered, but it could not always be kept, and so the long human night remained provisional, a pause beside fire, beside others, beside the damp ground, before the next morning asked the body to move again. A wet night is not felt equally by everybody. The strong adult may endure it with irritation, shifting, curling, and waking several times before morning, but a child, an older person, an injured person, or someone already tired from hunger and movement may feel the same dampness more deeply. This does not need to be turned into tragedy. It is simply how bodies differ. Small bodies lose heat more easily. Older joints often dislike cold and pressure. A person who is sick, wounded, pregnant, or exhausted may have less ability to adjust through the night. In a modern room, these differences are softened by walls, blankets, dry bedding, and a stable surface. In the deeper human past, they would have been closer to the center of nightly life. The question of a dry place to sleep was never only about individual comfort. It was also about care inside the group. When the ground was wet, someone had to be placed nearer warmth. When coverings were limited, someone had to share. When a shelter protected only part of the camp, the best place beneath it could not belong to everyone at once. A dry patch, if it existed, became a social space before it became a private one. This is one of the quiet truths of ancient sleep. The body did not face the night alone unless the group had already failed in some deeper way. Human beings are social animals, and for most of our history, survival depended on being near others. Nearness could protect sleep in ways no roof yet could. A child held against an adult body gained warmth. An elder resting closer to the fire may have been spared some of the cold that settled at the edge. A tired person might sleep between others, away from wind. A group could arrange itself so that the most exposed bodies were not always the weakest ones. We cannot know every arrangement, and we should not pretend to see every ancient family clearly, but the broad principle is reasonable. When protection is limited, care becomes part of shelter. At the beginning of human life, warmth, sleep, and belonging were likely tied together more tightly than they are in many modern bedrooms. Today, a person can sleep alone and still be protected by architecture. Long ago, the body often borrowed safety from other bodies. This matters especially for children. A child does not understand drainage, wind direction, smoke, or the slow loss of heat from damp ground. A child simply becomes cold, restless, or afraid. The adult body around the child becomes a living wall, a source of warmth and a boundary against the night. Dryness may have been partial, but closeness could reduce the cost of that partial failure. The same may have been true for older people, whose value in a group was not only physical strength. They may have carried memory, where to camp, which materials stayed drier, how weather changed after certain signs, which shelters had worked in past seasons. Yet the same older body that held memory could also be more vulnerable to cold, dampness, and hard ground. A group that benefited from memory also had reason to protect it. So the sleeping place became more than a patch of earth. It became an arrangement of generations. Children, adults, elders, and the weakened all met the same night, but not with the same needs. A dry place mattered because it allowed the group to protect its most delicate edges. If the night was damp, the group absorbed that dampness unevenly, through choices of position, covering, and closeness. This gives the history of dry sleep a human depth beyond tools and shelters. It was not just about making a better surface. It was about deciding, night after night, whose body most needed the small protection that the world allowed. The most vulnerable people in a group make the meaning of shelter clearer. A strong adult may be able to rise, gather more fuel, change position, shake dampness from a covering, or sleep lightly through discomfort. But a baby cannot improve the ground. A small child cannot judge whether mist will settle before dawn. An injured person may not be able to move closer to the fire without help. An older person may understand the landscape better than anyone, yet still feel the cold ground more sharply through bone, joint, and skin. When protection is limited, the group must become part of the shelter. This is one reason the ancient sleeping place should not be imagined as a row of separate bodies lying on separate patches of earth. It was more likely a shared arrangement, shaped by warmth, kinship, need, and the practical limits of the night. A child might be placed between adults, not only for comfort, but because two bodies hold heat better than one. Someone weak might be kept closer to the center, where smoke, warmth, and bodies formed a rough boundary against the dark. Someone stronger might take the colder edge, closer to wind, damp ground, or the open side of a shelter. These arrangements would not have been perfect. They would have changed with weather, group size, hunger, fatigue, and available materials. But they show a deeper point. Before dry rooms, care had to be physical. It had to be done with placement, closeness, covering, and attention. At the beginning of human life, sleep was not only the body resting, it was the group trying to keep its bodies usable until morning. This mattered because each generation depended on the others. Children carried the future but needed the most protection. Adults carried labor, food gathering, defense, and movement. Older people may have carried memory, skill, and knowledge of seasons, plants, roots, and shelter. A wet night could press differently against each of them. The child might wake and cry because the cold had reached through a damp layer. The adult might wake to adjust the fire or pull the child closer. The older person might wake because a hip or shoulder had pressed too long against cold ground. These small awakenings are not large events in history, but they are part of the real cost of sleeping without a dry place. They show how the lack of dry sleep could ripple through the group. If children slept poorly, adults slept poorly. If elders could not rest, memory and guidance became tired. If injured people grew colder, recovery became harder. The night touched the social body, not just the individual body. This is why even a slightly better sleeping surface could have value beyond comfort. A dry layer beneath a child could mean fewer awakenings. A protected corner for an older person could mean less stiffness in the morning. A hide kept dry by fire could become a shared resource. A patch under a ledge could be given to those who needed it most. Dryness, when rare, became a form of care. It was not only a private luxury. It was something the group may have distributed, defended, and remembered. Modern sleep often separates people into individual rooms and individual beds, making comfort feel personal. But in the long human past, comfort was often collective because exposure was collective. The rain did not choose one person. The damp ground lay under everyone. The cold air entered the whole camp. What differed was how the group arranged itself against those forces. This gives the question of dry sleep a gentler but deeper seriousness. Human beings did not survive wet nights only through toughness. They survived through bodies placed near other bodies, through shared warmth, through attention to the weakest, and through the slow learning that a place to sleep is also a place to protect one another. A dry place to sleep becomes more meaningful when we imagine who needed it most. Not the strongest body after an easy day, but the small child whose warmth faded quickly, the older person whose joints pressed painfully against the earth, the wounded person who could not shift without help, the exhausted mother holding a child through a cold dawn, the tired adult who still had to wake if the fire weakened. These bodies bring the question closer to real human life. The ancient night was not experienced by an average human. It was experienced by many bodies at once, each with different limits. One person might tolerate damp ground. Another might lose sleep because of it. One person might stay warm near the fire. Another, lying only a little farther away, might feel the wet edge of the camp. The same night could be bearable for one body and difficult for another. This unevenness likely shaped how people understood shelter long before permanent houses made protection more predictable. A shelter that was too small for everyone still mattered. A dry layer that could not cover the whole group still mattered. A place beneath an overhang, a patch of raised ground, a thicker bed of leaves, or a hide kept partly dry by fire could become valuable because it could be given where need was greatest. At the beginning of human life, care was not an idea separate from survival. It was part of survival itself. A group that protected its children protected its future. A group that allowed older people to rest protected memory. A group that helped the injured protected its own labour, kinship, and continuity. The sleeping place, then, was also a place where human bonds were quietly tested. Who slept closest to warmth? Who was shielded from wind? Who lay on the better surface? Who accepted the colder side? These questions were not necessarily spoken in the way we would speak them now, but they were answered by the arrangement of bodies. We should be careful not to turn this into a perfect picture of ancient kindness. Human groups could be stressed, hungry, frightened, or limited. Care was not unlimited, because resources were not unlimited. But the basic social nature of human beings suggests that sleeping together, sharing warmth, and protecting vulnerable members were central parts of survival. In a world with no guaranteed dry bed, the group itself became one of the first shelters. This is why the lack of dry sleep was more than a physical inconvenience. It affected the rhythm of generations. A child who slept against an adult body learned safety through warmth and closeness before ever understanding shelter as a structure. An elder who remembered a better camp might guide others toward ground that drained well after rain. Adults who lost sleep to wetness still had to rise, carry, gather, watch, and decide. The night did not end when morning came. Its quality entered the next day through tired muscles, slower movement, sharper cold, or greater patience. A damp night could echo into work, travel, and care. A drier night could give the group a little more strength to continue. Across deep time, these small differences mattered because they were repeated again and again. Dryness was not only about comfort. It was about preserving the bodies that carried the group forward. Children, adults, and elders all belonged to the same fragile chain. If sleep failed too often, the next day became harder. If warmth was shared well, the morning could begin with more steadiness. This is the quiet human meaning beneath the title. For most of history, people did not simply lack a dry place as isolated individuals. They faced wet ground as families, bands, and generations. They solved it partly with materials, partly with fire, partly with memory, and partly with one another. Before the house became a shelter, the group had already been a shelter. Before the bed lifted the body away from the ground, another body often did some of that work. And before dry sleep became ordinary, human beings learned that rest was something protected together, in the narrow space between damp earth and morning. The long road toward dry sleep may have begun with one simple discovery, repeated in many places. The body rests better when it is not pressed directly into the ground. This does not require a sudden invention, or a single moment when humans became clever enough to make a bed. It may have begun in small observations. Grass feels different from bare soil. Dry leaves are better than wet leaves. A layer of branches can lift the body slightly. Ash near an old fire can make the ground softer or drier for a time. A hide between skin and earth can hold warmth more closely. A raised root, a stone ledge, or a patch of sandy ground can change the whole feeling of a night. These are modest things, but in deep human history, modest things mattered. Before there was a bed, there was distance. Not much distance. Perhaps only a few fingers of plant material, a thicker layer of grass, a hide folded beneath the shoulder, or a sleeping place chosen because water ran around it instead of through it. But even a small distance could change the body's relationship with the wet earth. When the skin no longer touched soil directly, the ground lost some of its power. When the hip rested on a layer that did not immediately soak through, warmth stayed a little longer. When the back was raised above mud, the night became less punishing. The earliest steps away from wet sleep were probably not elegant. They were practical, local, and temporary. A person did not need to imagine a future bedroom to understand that the body disliked damp ground. The body taught that lesson every night. At the beginning of human life, people learned through contact. They learned what pressed too hard, what held water, what dried quickly, what smelled of rot, what kept insects away, what could be carried, and what had to be gathered again. This knowledge may have been passed not as abstract instruction but through habits, where adults placed children, how bedding was arranged near fire, which plants were pulled together, which surfaces were avoided after rain, which old camps were remembered as better places to sleep. Slowly, the sleeping place became something more than a natural patch of ground. It became a prepared surface. That change is important because it marks a shift in the human relationship with night. The body was no longer only accepting what the land offered. It was beginning to make a small space between itself and the land. This space did not yet guarantee dryness. A layer of plants could become wet. A hide could absorb moisture. A raised surface could collapse or be abandoned. But the idea was powerful. The ground could be modified before sleep. The sleeper did not have to meet the earth completely unprotected. Over time, this small idea could grow in many directions. People might choose thicker bedding. They might clear stones from a sleeping area. They might place dry material over colder soil. They might return to places where old hearths had made the ground more usable. They might sleep on slightly raised natural features or build simple raised arrangements when materials allowed. Each step increased separation, not absolute comfort. The goal was not luxury. It was less cold, less damp, less pressure, fewer awakenings, and enough recovery to continue. This is how the history of dry sleep begins to move from endurance toward design. The body still belonged to the weather, but not as completely as before. The ground was still beneath the sleeper, but now there was a human answer placed between them. It might be fragile. It might last only one night. It might disappear without a trace, yet it changed the meaning of rest. Dry sleep did not arrive all at once as a finished invention. It began as a thin layer, a remembered surface, a careful choice, and a quiet refusal to let the wet earth touch the body without resistance. Once the body begins to rise even slightly above the ground, sleep changes in a quiet but important way. The sleeper is still close to earth, still near weather, still dependent on fire, shelter, and the group, but the contact is no longer completely direct. A layer has appeared. A thin barrier now stands between skin and soil, between warmth and dampness, between the pressure of bone and the hardness of stone. This small separation may seem ordinary to us because modern beds make distance from the ground feel natural. But in deep human history, even a little separation would have been meaningful. It could decide whether cold entered quickly or slowly. It could decide whether moisture touched the body before midnight or only near dawn. It could decide whether a child stayed asleep longer, whether an older person woke with less stiffness, whether a tired adult could rest deeply enough to move again the next day. The early movement away from wet ground was not only a matter of materials, it was a matter of attention. People had to notice that some surfaces behaved differently from others. Dry grasses might insulate better than fresh green plants. Leaves might be useful if gathered from a dry place, but unpleasant if taken from shaded damp ground. Bark might shed water in one direction, but trap it in another. Sand might drain better than mud, but offer less softness. Ash near an old hearth might make a surface less raw, but it could also mix with moisture and become cold again. The sleeping place became a small field of judgment. The body asked for comfort, but the land gave mixed answers, and people learned to sort those answers by experience. At the beginning of human life, these lessons were probably repeated across generations without needing to become formal knowledge. A child could learn by watching where adults lay down materials. A young person could learn why one hollow was avoided after rain. Older members of a group could remember which camps stayed drier in certain seasons. In this way, the first steps toward dry sleep were also steps toward cultural memory. The surface beneath the body was no longer just found. It was selected, improved, and remembered. This is a slow but important shift. Once people begin preparing a sleeping surface, they are no longer only reacting to the night after it arrives. They are preparing for the night before the body becomes helpless in sleep. They are thinking ahead with the body in mind. A layer of grass, a folded hide, a cleared patch, a raised edge of earth, a group of branches under bedding, each one says, in a simple physical language, that the sleeper should not have to surrender completely to wet soil. Yet these improvements still remained fragile. They depended on available plants, weather, time, energy, and how long the group planned to stay. A prepared surface could help tonight and be abandoned tomorrow. A slightly raised place could work in one season and fail in another. A bedding layer could be dry when gathered and damp by morning. Nothing had yet become permanent enough to guarantee rest. Still, something had changed. The human body was beginning to create a boundary. Not a wall, not a room, not a sealed floor, but a boundary made from chosen materials and repeated knowledge. This boundary was thin, and the wet earth often crossed it. But even a thin boundary can change the history of sleep. It teaches the body that the ground can be answered. It teaches the group that rest can be protected before suffering begins. It opens the long path from lying on whatever nature offered to building surfaces meant specifically for recovery. Dry sleep, then, did not begin as a luxury. It began as a practical kindness toward the body, a small attempt to let warmth remain, to let pressure soften, and to let the human night become a little less dependent on the damp patience of the ground. The distance between the body and the ground did not need to be large to matter. A hand's thickness of dry grass, a folded hide, a layer of bark, a mat of reeds, or a few branches beneath softer material could change the whole meaning of sleep. The body might still hear rain. It might still feel cold air. It might still depend on fire and other bodies for warmth. But the wet earth was no longer touching every part of it directly. That small distance was the beginning of a new human idea. Rest could be shaped before it happened. A sleeping place could be prepared, not merely accepted. This was not yet a bedroom. It was not even a bed in the modern sense. It was a human answer placed between flesh and ground. That answer could fail, and often it probably did. A layer could soak through, branches could press into the ribs, leaves could rot, a hide could become heavy with moisture, a raised patch could still grow cold by dawn, but the attempt itself shows a change in the long relationship between people and night. Early humans were not simply surviving the ground. They were beginning to redesign the point where the body met it. At the beginning of human life, this redesign was slow, local, and uneven. One group in one landscape might rely on grasses. Another might use reeds, hides, bark, ash, stones, or natural ledges. Some places offered better materials than others. Some seasons made dry bedding easier to gather. Some climates made wetness return almost as soon as it was pushed away. There was no single path from damp ground to dry sleep. There were many small paths, each shaped by environment, memory, and need. What connects them is the same bodily problem. The sleeper needed separation. Not complete separation, but enough to lose less warmth, feel less pressure, and stay less exposed to moisture rising from below. This is why prepared sleeping surfaces were more than simple comfort. They were part of a broader human movement toward making the environment a little more predictable. A cleared floor made the ground less sharp. A bedding layer made the body less vulnerable to cold soil. A raised surface, when possible, made water less powerful. A remembered camp made the next night less uncertain. These things did not remove weather, but they softened its authority. The night still belonged partly to rain, mist, wind, stone, and soil, yet now it also belonged partly to human preparation. That is an important threshold. Once a group learns that sleep can be improved, the place of rest becomes part of culture. It can be taught, copied, adjusted, and remembered. Children can grow up seeing that bodies are placed carefully, that some materials are saved, that some ground is avoided, that a better sleeping place is worth effort before darkness. Over long spans of time, such habits can become quiet traditions. They may leave little evidence after they decay, but they can still shape how people live. The path toward dry sleep was likely built from countless such habits, not from one grand invention. It moved from choosing a better patch of ground, to laying down material, to returning to useful shelters, to raising the body higher, to building floors, and later to making spaces where water was guided away. But at this point in the story, the transformation was still incomplete. The body had risen slightly, but not escaped. The sleeping place had become more human, but not fully dry. The earth still pressed upward. Moisture still found its way through weak layers. Fire still faded. Camp still moved. Yet the old pattern had been changed forever. A dry place to sleep was no longer only a lucky discovery in the landscape. It was becoming something humans could try to make. A house is easy to misunderstand if we see it only as a better place to sleep. A dry room does help the sleeping body, but the first stronger shelters and more settled homes were tied to many needs at once. People did not build more lasting spaces only because the ground was uncomfortable. They built and improved shelters because life itself was becoming more concentrated in certain places, at certain seasons, or around certain resources. Food had to be stored, tools had to be kept, fire needed protection, children needed a safer center. Materials gathered with effort needed somewhere to remain useful. In colder or wetter landscapes, a stronger shelter could preserve warmth and reduce exposure. In places where people returned again and again, it made sense to repair, thicken, raise, and remember the same structure. Dry sleep was part of this change, but it was not the whole story. The body benefited from the house, but the house belonged to a wider transformation of human life. Before permanent homes became ordinary, a sleeping place could be improved for a night, a season, or a repeated camp. But once people began staying longer, returning more predictably, or protecting stored resources, the place itself became more valuable. A floor could be cleared not just once, but again and again. Water could be guided away from the same area. A roof could be repaired after rain. Walls could grow thicker. Smoke could be managed better over time. A raised surface could remain in place instead of being abandoned at dawn. These repeated improvements slowly changed sleep because they changed the relationship between people and ground. The sleeping body no longer had to ask a new piece of earth for permission every night. It could return to a place that had already been worked on, remembered, and defended against weather. At the beginning of human life, such stability was limited. Movement, season, food, and climate kept many groups close to temporary shelters. But in some times and places, especially where resources allowed longer stays, the sleeping place could become part of a more durable human center. This did not suddenly create perfect dryness. Early homes could still be smoky, damp, crowded, cold, or difficult to maintain. Roofs could leak, floors could remain earthen, water could enter, animals, insects, and decay could still be near. But a settled shelter gave people something temporary camps rarely could: the chance to improve the same place over time. That chance matters. Dryness is not only made by covering the body, it is made by systems working together. Rain must be stopped from above. Ground moisture must be reduced from below. Wind must be softened from the sides. Bedding must be protected from soaking. Fire must be placed where it warms without making the air unbearable. People must have time to repair what weather damages. A house, even a simple one, begins to gather these solutions into one place. It turns dryness from a lucky condition into a repeated project. This is why the history of dry sleep is also the history of storage, settlement, family life, tools, fuel, food, and memory. A dry sleeping surface becomes easier to keep when the group has reasons to remain. A roof becomes worth strengthening when people expect to return beneath it. A floor becomes worth raising when the same bodies will lie there again. The ancient body did not move into the house only to be comfortable. It moved into a new relationship with time. The night was no longer only something endured and left behind. It became something prepared for, repaired after, and slowly brought under human control. Yet even then, the wet ground was not defeated all at once. It remained under the floor, outside the wall, in the roof material, in the smoke, in the season, and in the work required to keep shelter from returning to earth. A more permanent shelter changes sleep because it changes what can be repeated. In a moving camp, the group may learn from a place, then leave it. In a more settled place, that learning can remain in the ground, the wall. the roof, and the floor. A leak can be repaired after one storm so it fails less badly in the next. A smoky hearth can be adjusted. A wet corner can be avoided, raised, drained, or used for something other than sleep. A bedding area can be kept apart from mud, tools, food waste, and the busiest movement of the shelter. These may sound like small improvements, but repeated small improvements are how the ordinary dry rooms slowly became possible. Dryness did not come from one invention alone. It came from the gathering of many solutions in the same place over time. This is why houses cannot be understood only as sleeping machines. They were also places where food, fire, children, tools, memories, and social life could stay close together. When a group stores food, the stored food needs protection from rain, animals, insects, and rot. When tools take effort to make, they become worth keeping dry. When children are young, a stable center gives adults a place to return to and organize care. When fuel is collected, it is useful to keep some of it from becoming too wet to burn. All of these needs encourage stronger shelter. And once stronger shelter exists, sleep changes as a result. The body receives benefits from a structure built for more than the body. It lies on a surface that has been cleared because people live there. It rests under a roof repaired because food and fire need protection. It sleeps inside walls strengthened because the group has reason to remain. At the beginning of human life, these conditions were not the normal pattern everywhere. Many human communities continued to move, and many shelters remained seasonal, temporary, or mixed in form. The transition toward more durable living places was uneven, depending on climate, resources, technology, and ways of life. But wherever people could stay longer, the night could be worked on more carefully. A floor could slowly become less like raw earth. It might be packed, cleared, covered, raised, or separated into areas. A sleeping space could become less exposed to direct wetness. A roof could be thickened where rain entered. A wall could reduce wind enough that a damp night felt less cold. Fire could be placed with more memory of how smoke moved. The sleeping body benefited from this growing memory built into the place itself. Still, it is important not to imagine early houses as clean, dry, private bedrooms. Many early shelters would have been crowded by modern standards. Smoke, animals, stored materials, damp floors, insects, leaking roofs, and cold seasons could still make sleep difficult. The difference was not perfection. The difference was that shelter could now be improved in place. The wet ground was no longer met as a completely new problem every evening. It could be managed through repeated repair. Water could be watched. Weak points could be remembered. Materials could be stored for future use. The same roof that failed once could be made better. This repeated effort slowly changed the meaning of dry sleep. It moved from luck toward maintenance. A dry sleeping place became something people had to keep making, not only something they had to find. That distinction matters. Modern comfort hides maintenance, because roofs, floors, drains, fabrics, and walls are already present when we lie down. But in the deeper past, every layer of dryness had to be earned by labor and memory. The house did not simply appear as an answer to discomfort. It grew out of many pressures, and then it quietly changed the body's nights. It gave sleep a place where improvement could accumulate. It allowed the human body to rest in a space that was not fully free from weather, but no longer surrendered to it each night as completely as before. A house turns the night into something that can be prepared for before it arrives. That may be its deepest change. In the open camp, people could choose, arrange, warm, and cover a place, but much of that work had to begin again with each stop. In a more durable shelter, the work could remain. A raised floor did not have to be rebuilt every morning. A roof could keep protecting the same sleeping area after many nights of repair. A wall could hold back wind in a familiar direction. Stored bedding could be kept drier than bedding carried through rain. Fuel could be protected so fire was easier to make when the air turned cold. The sleeping body began to rest inside accumulated effort. This is why dry sleep belongs not only to invention but to continuity. A dry place needs time. It needs people to return, notice, repair, adjust, and improve. It needs the same ground to be worked again and again until it stops behaving like raw ground. It needs water to be guided away. It needs the roof to be watched after storms. It needs materials to be kept from rot. It needs a community to care enough about tomorrow's sleep to labor today. In that sense, the house did not simply protect the body from weather. It stored human attention. Every patch, every raised surface, every repaired leak, every cleared floor, every dry bundle of bedding was a small memory built into space. At the beginning of human life, sleep had followed movement closely. The body rested where the group could stop. Later, in more settled conditions, sleep could begin to belong to a place that waited. This did not mean ancient houses were clean or perfectly dry. Many were probably smoky, crowded, dark, earthy, noisy, and still touched by dampness. Rain could still enter. Floors could still be cold. Roofs made of natural materials could still fail. Insects, animals, ashes, food remains, stored goods, and human bodies all shared space. But even an imperfect house changed the question. The sleeper was no longer asking only, "Where can we lie tonight?" The group could begin to ask, "How can this place be made better for the nights to come?" That question marks a major shift in the history of rest. Dryness became something maintained across time. It became part of household labor, not only nightly luck. The body benefited because the place had memory. A bad, wet corner could be avoided or changed. A floor that stayed cold could be covered more thickly. A roof that leaked could be strengthened. A sleeping area could be placed where smoke, wind, and runoff were less harmful. These improvements may have been small by modern standards, but they moved human sleep farther from the old condition of lying directly within weather. The ground still existed beneath the shelter, but it was now being answered by structure. Water still moved, but humans were learning to move it away. Cold still came, but walls, fire, bodies, and stored materials could work together against it. This is why the rise of more durable shelter cannot be reduced to comfort. It was tied to food, children, tools, territory, memory, season, and the slow concentration of human life. Yet once those forces gathered, sleep was transformed with them. The dry bed was not the first cause. It was one result of a larger change. Humans were beginning to make places that lasted longer than a single night. For most of history, the sleeper had belonged to the landscape. With stronger shelter, the sleeper began to belong partly to a built world. But that built world remained young, fragile, and uneven. The long memory of wet ground did not vanish at once. It stayed beneath the floor, outside the wall, and inside the labor required to keep a place dry. A dry bed is so ordinary now that it can make the body forget how unusual it is. The mattress does not feel like an invention. The roof does not feel like a historical event. The floor does not feel like a barrier between flesh and soil. They all seem like the normal background of sleep. A person lies down, pulls a blanket close, hears rain outside, and remains untouched by it. The body receives this protection quietly, night after night, until dryness feels less like a human achievement and more like a natural right. But this feeling is historically young. For most of the time humans have existed, sleep did not happen inside such reliable separation. The body lay closer to ground, weather, smoke, plants, stone, other bodies, and the slow changes of night air. The modern room hides this older relationship so completely that the absence of wetness can feel invisible. We notice dryness only when it fails. A damp sheet becomes unpleasant at once. A wet pillow feels wrong. A cold floor in the morning can make the whole body tighten. A blanket that has absorbed humidity feels heavier and less safe. These small modern discomforts remind us that the body has not forgotten everything. It still reacts as if wetness matters, because wetness does matter to a warm sleeping animal. The difference is that our surroundings now protect us before the problem becomes serious. A sealed roof takes rain away before it reaches skin. A raised bed keeps the body from the cold floor. A dry blanket holds warmth around the sleeper. A wall keeps wind from crossing the face. The body still has ancient needs, but the modern room answers many of them before consciousness notices. This is why comfort can erase history. When protection is constant, the struggle that created it disappears from view. At the beginning of human life, there was no such automatic answer. The body had to feel the place directly. It had to know whether the ground was cold, whether the air was wet, whether a covering would hold warmth, whether the fire would last, whether others were close enough, whether morning would arrive with enough strength left to move. Modern sleep removes many of these questions. It turns them into architecture, fabric, drainage, heating, flooring, and habit. The old negotiation with the ground becomes hidden beneath technology and routine, yet the body still carries signs of that older negotiation. It prefers warmth when still. It curls when cold. It dislikes damp contact. It searches for covering. It feels safer when the space around it is predictable. It relaxes more easily when the surface beneath it does not threaten pressure, chill, or wetness. These reactions do not prove one simple ancient scene, but they fit the long condition of a species that spent much of its history resting close to the earth. The bed may be modern, but the sleeper is not. The sleeper is an old body inside a new room. This difference matters because it changes how we understand comfort. A dry bed is not merely softness, it is stored human labour. It is generations of learning how to lift the body, shed rain, protect materials, control smoke, reduce insects, manage dampness, and make the night predictable. Every quiet bedroom stands at the far end of many older nights when protection was partial and uncertain. When we forget that, comfort becomes weightless. We treat it as if it has always been there, but the body's older reactions suggest otherwise. Beneath the calm of modern sleep is a much longer memory of wet ground, cold air, shared warmth, and the fragile hope that the place chosen for the night would hold until morning. The modern bedroom does more than keep the sleeper dry. It changes what the sleeper expects from the world. A person who has lived for years with a roof, a floor, a mattress, and clean bedding begins to feel that sleep should happen without negotiation. The room should stay still. The surface should stay warm enough. The blanket should remain dry. The air should not turn suddenly harsh. The body should be able to stop working and trust the space around it. This expectation feels normal because it is repeated every night. Yet in the longer history of our species, it is a recent kind of trust. For most of human time, the body could not assume that the place of rest would remain friendly until morning. The ground could change. The weather could shift. Moisture could gather. Fire could fade. Smoke could move. A child could wake cold. A covering could lose its warmth. Tall. The sleeper could not fully leave the world, because the world was still touching the sleeper. This is why the dry bed can make us misunderstand the ancient body. We may imagine discomfort as an occasional problem, something that happened only during storms, migrations, or bad seasons. But for people living close to Earth, dampness and cold were not always rare events. They could be ordinary features of night. A place did not need to be flooded to be difficult. It only needed to be damp enough to pull heat away, cold enough to wake the joints, uneven enough to keep the spine alert, or exposed enough that the body could not fully soften. Modern sleep hides these smaller pressures. It gives the body a stable stage, so we forget how many things must go right for deep rest to happen. At the beginning of human life, deep rest was not just a matter of being tired. It depended on the relationship between the body and the place where tiredness landed. A modern person may feel this older truth only when comfort breaks. A camping trip after rain, a damp blanket, a cold floor, a leaking roof, or one night without enough covering can suddenly make sleep feel physical again. The body becomes aware of surfaces. It notices the direction of air, it seeks warmth, it guards itself. It becomes less like a mind drifting into dreams and more like an animal trying to keep its heat through the dark. These moments are small reminders, not direct windows into the past, but they help us understand why dry sleep mattered so much. A warm, dry place allows the body to stop defending itself. It allows muscles to loosen without immediately tightening again. It allows sleep to become longer, deeper, and less broken. When that place is missing, the body may still sleep, but it sleeps with interruptions, with adjustments, with partial attention to the world. The dry bedroom has made this older kind of sleep feel distant. It has turned protection into background. It has hidden the labour of drainage, roofing, flooring, weaving, storing, repairing, heating, and cleaning. It has also changed the emotional meaning of night. Darkness indoors may feel peaceful because walls they slat at a distance. Rain may sound soothing because it cannot reach the bed. Cold may feel pleasant because warmth is available nearby, but these feelings depend on a protected space. Remove that space, and the same night becomes different. Rain is no longer sound alone. It is water looking for an entrance. Cold is no longer atmosphere alone. It is a force moving through ground, cloth, and skin. Darkness is no longer only quiet. It is an environment shared with other living things. This does not mean modern comfort is false. It means modern comfort is powerful. It has taught the body to expect a kind of safety that most human bodies before us could only find briefly, unevenly, or after great effort. And because this safety is so constant, we forget that the sleeper inside the bed is still an old creature, carrying ancient needs into a room that history built very late. What the modern bedroom makes invisible is not only wetness, but dependence. A sleeper today may feel independent because the room is already doing so much work. The roof depends on builders, materials, repairs, and drainage. The floor depends on the idea that the body should not lie on bare earth. The mattress depends on stored softness, shaped and protected for repeated use. The blanket depends on fibers kept dry. The walls depend on the long human wish to make the night predictable. None of this is noticed when it works. The body simply receives the result as calm. But in deep time, calm had to be made from much less. A sleeping place might depend on a fire that could fade, a covering that could dampen, a shelter that could leak, a slope that could change after rain, and other bodies that could share warmth through the coldest hours. The ancient sleeper was never only resting. The ancient sleeper was resting inside a chain of fragile conditions. This is one of the reasons dry sleep feels ordinary now. While it was once uncertain for so long, modern people often think of comfort as a personal preference. One person likes a soft bed, another likes a firm one. One person likes a cool room, another likes more blankets. But beneath these preferences is a deeper layer that all warm-blooded bodies share. The body needs enough warmth to stop guarding itself. It needs enough dryness to keep heat from being drawn away. It needs a surface that does not constantly disturb pressure points. It needs enough safety for the brain to lower its watchfulness. In a dry bedroom, these needs are quietly supported before sleep begins. In the older human world, they had to be negotiated each night with ground, fire, weather, shelter, and group life. At the beginning of human life, there was no clear line between the place of living and the place of sleeping. The same earth that held footprints also held the tired body. The same weather that shaped the day entered the night. The same materials used for carrying, covering, burning, or building might also become part of the sleeping surface. Nothing was purely for sleep in the modern sense. The body rested inside a life where every object had many possible uses and every dry layer had value. This older condition has not entirely vanished from our instincts, and we still understand, without needing to explain it, that dampness makes a bed feel wrong. We still pull blankets close when cold reaches the skin. We still prefer to sleep slightly raised above the floor. We still feel uneasy when a sleeping place seems exposed, unstable, or too open to the outside. These reactions are not evidence of one simple prehistoric scene, and they should not be forced into a single story. But they do show that our bodies respond to the same basic conditions that mattered long before the modern room existed. A dry bed lets the body forget its own vulnerability. That is part of its kindness. It allows sleep to feel private, soft, and removed from the land. Yet this kindness can also make history disappear. It can make us forget that dry sleep is not the natural state of the earth. It is a human arrangement, built slowly from fire, shelter, memory, shared warmth, prepared surfaces, stored materials, and the long desire to wake with more strength than the night had taken. When we lie down now, we are resting inside many generations of answers. The rain outside may sound gentle because others learned how to keep it outside. The floor may feel ordinary because others learned how to lift the body away from soil. The blanket may feel simple because others learned how to keep warmth dry. And somewhere beneath that ordinary comfort is the older human body, still able to recognize what it means when the ground is cold, the air is wet, and sleep has no dry place to belong. By the time dry sleep becomes ordinary, it no longer feels like an achievement. It becomes background. The roof is simply there. The floor is simply there. The bed waits each night, as if it has always waited. But when we follow the long human story backward, this quiet comfort becomes one of the strangest changes in our relationship with the earth. For most of our history, the body did not enter sleep by leaving the natural world behind. It entered sleep while still touching it. The night came through damp soil, cold air, wet grass, stone, smoke, rain, insects, and the uncertain edge of shelter. Rest happened close to the same ground that had shaped the day. This does not mean every ancient night was suffering. It means that sleep was less separated from the conditions of survival. The body could be tired, but the world still had to allow rest. The ground had to be usable. The fire had to last. The covering had to stay warm enough. The group had to remain close enough. The sky had to be kind enough, or the shelter strong enough for sleep to deepen. A dry place was not guaranteed. It was found, made, shared, repaired, lost, and found again. At the beginning of human life, the body learned this lesson without words. It learned that a small rise in the land mattered. It learned that wet leaves could betray softness. It learned that closeness could save warmth. It learned that fire helped, but had edges. It learned that stone could shelter and chill at the same time. It learned that a shelter was not the same as a room, and a covering was not the same as a dry bed. Across many generations, people answered these problems slowly. They gathered better materials. They remembered better camps. They lifted the body slightly. They placed fire more carefully. They protected children and elders near the center. They returned to useful places. They built stronger shelters when life allowed them to stay. None of this happened all at once. Dry sleep was not born as luxury. It was born as a series of small protections against the wet earth. That is the educational value hidden inside this question. A bed is not just a bed. A dry room is not just a room. They are the quiet result of human attention, stretched across deep time. They carry the history of shelter, labor, cooperation, memory, and care. The modern sleeper receives all of that without needing to think about it. Rain can fall outside, and the body remains calm. Wind can move past the wall, and the breath stays slow. The ground can be cold beneath the building, and the skin never touches it. This separation is so complete that it can make us forget how young it is. But remembering it does not need to make us uneasy. It can make us more aware. It can remind us that comfort is not weakness. Comfort is often the name we give to problems our ancestors had to solve with patience, skill, and one another. A dry bed is a small monument to human survival, though it does not look like one. It has no stone inscription. It does not announce itself as history. It waits in silence, holding the body above the ground. And perhaps that is why this story belongs in a sleep audio. It brings the mind back to something simple, steady, and human, the strange gift of lying down without fighting the earth. Tonight, the body may rest in a place that countless earlier bodies slowly made possible. Yet even here, inside a dry room, one question remains open. How much of the old night still sleeps inside us? There is a quiet danger in thinking of ancient comfort as if it were simply the absence of progress. We might look backward and imagine people waiting for better inventions, as if the bed, the roof, and the dry room were obvious solutions delayed by time. But the deeper story is slower and more human than that. People did not move from wet ground to dry sleep because they suddenly discovered the wish to be comfortable. The body had always wished for warmth, rest, and relief from cold pressure. The change came because many other conditions slowly gathered around that wish. People learned places. They remembered seasons. They shaped fire. They carried coverings. They protected children. They returned to useful camps. They made shelters stronger when life allowed them to remain. They developed ways of storing, repairing, building, and arranging space. Dry sleep emerged from this wide web of survival, not from comfort alone. That makes the modern bed less ordinary than it appears. It is not just a soft object under the body. It is the final visible surface of many older solutions. Beneath it is the raised floor. Beneath the floor is the idea that the body should not lie directly on soil. Above it is the roof. Around it are walls. Inside it are dry fibers. And behind all of these are generations of people learning how water moves, how cold enters, how bodies recover, and how shelter can be maintained. At the beginning of human life, None of these answers existed together in one reliable place. Sleep was still attached to the land. It was attached to drainage, dampness, smoke, social closeness, and the fragile line between enough warmth and too little. That older condition can help us see modern comfort with more honesty. Comfort is not only indulgence, it is also protection. It is the difference between a body that must spend part of the night defending itself and a body that can truly soften. It is the difference between sleep interrupted by wet ground and sleep held inside a stable space. It is the difference between a child kept warm only by another body and a child protected by the whole structure of a home. This does not mean modern life is simple or always restful. Many people still sleep poorly, and many still lack safe, dry housing. That fact makes the history even more important, not less. A dry place to sleep should not be dismissed as a small convenience. It is one of the basic conditions that allow the human body to recover with dignity. When we understand how long our species lived without reliable dryness, we can better understand the value of shelter in the present. A room that keeps rain away is not trivial. A floor that separates the body from mud is not trivial. A blanket that stays dry through the night is not trivial. These things protect the sleeping body in ways so quiet that they are easy to overlook. The long story of wet sleep also teaches a gentler lesson about human adaptation. Humans did not survive because they were perfectly suited to every environment. They survived because they could cooperate, observe, remember, adjust, and slowly build layers between vulnerability and the world. The dry bed is one of those layers. It is late, modest, and easy to ignore, but it carries a deep message. Much of civilization begins with protecting the tired body. Before cities, before written records, before the modern bedroom, there was the simple need to rest without losing too much warmth to the ground. That need followed human beings through rain, mist, caves, forests, firesides, camps, and early homes. And even now, when the room is dry and the night is held outside, the old need remains beneath the comfort, quiet but unchanged. The story of dry sleep ends, for now, in a room that feels ordinary. A roof holds back the rain. A floor lifts the body away from soil. A bed waits above the cold surface below. A blanket keeps warmth close. These things do not seem ancient, because they are not, but they are built on ancient needs. The body lying down tonight still belongs to the same long human line that once had to read the ground before darkness, gather dry material before mist came, keep a fire alive, and trust other bodies for warmth. The world has changed around the sleeper, but the sleeper's basic vulnerability has not disappeared. A tired body still needs warmth. It still needs dryness. It still needs enough safety to stop watching the night. That is why the question matters. Why did so much of human history have no dry place to sleep? Not because humans did not care about comfort, not because ancient people failed to feel cold, dampness, pressure, or fear. They felt those things directly, through skin, muscle, breath, and bone. The deeper reason is that dryness required many conditions to come together. It required materials that could resist water. It required knowledge of land and weather. It required fire, shelter, group care, memory, repeated repair, and eventually places stable enough to improve across time. A dry bed is simple only after all those layers already exist. Before then, sleep was a nightly compromise with the earth. Sometimes the ground was tolerable. Sometimes a ledge, a fire, a hide, a layer of plants, or the warmth of others made the night easier. Sometimes the body rested only in fragments. Across deep time, most people slept not in perfect protection, but in partial protection. That distinction is important. Human history is not only the story of great monuments, tools, migrations, wars, or inventions. It is also the story of small protections placed between the body and the world. A branch roof, a warmer corner, a cleared patch, a shared covering, a child held close, a remembered camp, a floor raised just enough to keep water away. These quiet acts do not always leave dramatic evidence, but they carry the shape of human care. They show that civilization begins not only when people build upward, but when they make the ground less cruel to the tired body. To notice this is not to romanticize hardship. Wet sleep was not noble by itself. Cold ground was not wisdom. Dampness was not a lesson people needed. But the long effort to answer those conditions tells us something valuable about our species. Humans survive by building small distances between danger and vulnerability. They do it with tools, with memory, with shelter, and with one another. The dry room is one of those distances. It is a quiet achievement, so familiar that we almost never thank it. And perhaps the most useful thought to carry from this long history is a simple one. Comfort becomes deeper when we understand what it protects. A dry bed protects sleep, but it also protects recovery, patience, childhood, aging, healing, and the strength to begin again. Tonight, when rain remains outside, when the floor stays beneath you, when the blanket keeps its warmth, the body may not need to know the whole story, but somewhere beneath that calm is an older memory of ground, weather, fire, and closeness. The room is new, the need is ancient, and as the body rests in this late human shelter, the final question can remain open. How much of our sleep still belongs to the nights before we had a dry place to sleep?